basic algebra at that point. So let's see how this works, okay? The hardest part is choosing where each part goes. It's not the formula itself. So depending on which one you want to use, it doesn't matter. We get our RE equals nominal minus inflation, okay? So let's say you lend out $100. Okay. You lend out $100 with 20% interest rate. The inflation rate is 15%. A year later, you get back 120. What we want to know is how much are you actually making on this loan a year later? Okay. We know for the year, the inflation rate is 15%. So all we do is we take this formula right here and we just start plugging in our values. I always start with interest rate because that is the easiest one and I never get confused and I know what it is. I plug that in on the back. Since it's subtracted here, we'll put that right there. Now I just have to decide what is this 20% interest here, okay? Is this nominal or real? Well, take a look. If we're just taking this, multiplying it by straight 100 and then adding it together to get the 120, I haven't even factored out the inflation rate on this particular one, right? So this must be my nominal. So what you'll do is you'll put it right here, 20%. Okay. That means your real interest rate, if we calculated this, would be 5%. Okay. So what does this all mean? Well, if you borrow today $100, 1 year later, you're going to pay back 120. Okay. But inflation is 15%. So really that $100 today, 1 year later, it would take $115 to be equal to what $100 is today. Okay, that's how much prices have grown by. So technically, how much did this loan cost you? Well, if this was my whole thing and I'm just putting in values here, technically, this loan cost me $5. Okay, that's what it cost me. Actually, this is what I gained because I lent it out. I didn't borrow in this case, right? So what did I gain from doing this loan? Okay, so I lent this out to Kenny, for example. A year later, that $100 is worth 115. Okay, but I got back 120. That means my gain total here was $5 or 5%. Okay, it's not a bad deal if I was lending out. That's what I should have done in this particular case. Okay, and you can see how we calculated everything as we got. There's my nominals, 20%. Real interest rate is 5%. Okay, so we had more purchasing power. That's a good deal to lend out. Now let's say number 2, I lend out 100. So we jump to the next person here. Okay, so I lend it out to Matthew. Let's see. What's my question here? So what is the nominal? What is the real? We're just going to plug it in again. Again, always start with the inflation. That's 20%. Okay. How do I know this is nominal? Because I just took these two straight and I didn't even factor out the inflation. That must mean 10%. Okay. So in this case, what is going to happen? This is going to be negative 10%. Okay. Negative 10%. So what is this saying? This is saying that if today I lent out $100 to Matthew, at the end of a year, at the end of 1 year, he's going to pay me back $110. Okay, sounds good. However, if I look at what prices actually increased to, it's $120. Okay, that means, let's just say, I'm going to make up something really stupid. What costs $100? Let's say a cell phone. Okay, $100 buys a cell phone, right? Today. 1 year later, I'll need 120 So I'm going to need $20 more to buy the same cell phone. However, take a look. He's only given me $110, which means I lost value on this loan. So this was a bad mistake on my part. If I was lending this value out, okay, Matthew actually gained in this case because the real interest rate was -10. So he basically gained $10 in this little scenario that I did right here. And as a bank, I lost that. So here's the idea. Your bank should always have a positive real interest rate because they have to pay back their employees, they have to make some money so they can pay back their investors and everything else. Okay. So notice I did gain more money, but the purchasing power of that money is what's been diminished. I'm going to clear that. Okay, so let's get to our graph here. And here's going to be the graph. We'll build this graph here. This is going to be our loanable funds. But here's the problem that I need to point out from you guys. Don't mix these two graphs, okay? They're very similar, and you can actually make a lot of things the same here. And so people get them confused and they make mistakes. Don't make those mistakes. We're going to practice these a little bit so it doesn't happen. But here's some differences. This one's going to be real. This one's going to be nominal. Okay, so notice this is our NER. This will be our rear. Okay, quantity of money is still the same on the bottom. Okay, notice for today I put borrows and savers, but really you could label this DL and I will and SL. You put the L to represent loanable funds, just like here is money market. That's how you kind of note that it is. But I wanted to point out that what the loanable funds brings together is savers and borrowers. What the money market brings together is the Fed and banks. So it's two different institutions here, okay? And there's always a test question, and there'll be a test question on your test as well too, where it says, what is the loanable funds? Who does the loanable funds bring together? Borrowers and savers. And we're going to see how that works here and why it's different from the money market. So notice this one also, screw that up. Change beds. Notice this one's perfectly vertical right here. That's because the Fed controls this one. We actually control this one over here. We're going to see how that works out. Okay, so this is going to be much more relatable to us because that's the one we deal with. So it brings together, oh, this is the private sector, by the way. Always the private sector. So if you want to go borrow money, a business wants to go borrow money, even if the government wants to go borrow money, we're going to be dealing with the loanable funds, not the money market. Okay, not the money market in this particular case. Now we're going to see how this one does affect, because remember, your nominal interest rate, right? So for example, it should work like this, ideally, if you're thinking about it here. So the Fed, let's say, charges the bank 3%. Okay. So we'll call this bank. Kind of screw that up. Shoot. So the bank, the Fed charges the bank 3%, and then you have you over here. The bank is going to charge you over that to collect some value. Okay. Because they need to pay back whatever it is. So let's say, for example, I lent, I'm the Fed and I lend Matthew $100. He's going to pay me back eventually 103. Okay. Matthew, to make money as the bank, he's got to lend it out to somebody else. Let's say Jianhao. So that's going to be 105. He's eventually going to pay back. So overall, what should happen is, I forgot who my banking person is, but whoever it is, they should collect a little profit off of that one. Okay. And we're going to see how this all ties together here. Get a little ahead of myself. Okay. So this shows real interest rate here, and we're going to look at how this actually works. Now, demand, for example, works the same as this one. When interest rates are high, we don't borrow money. Over here, same for the banks. When the nominal interest rate's really high, banks tend not to borrow money. When the interest rates get really low, banks will borrow money, right? It's cheap to borrow. Same for you. Okay, when interest rates really high, we don't want to borrow that money. But when interest rates get really low, hey, it's a good time to borrow. You can see that right now with the housing market. Okay, everybody is buying a house right now who can afford one because it is so low on the rates that banks are charging you. It's about 3%. You might as well do it. It's pretty much you're not paying anything over the course of 30 years. Okay. Supply, though, is a little bit different. And here's how supply works. So let's say, oh, I keep pulling up the wrong one. Supply is really low. So I don't like to keep too much money in a savings or checking account. Will I have some? Yes, because when I go to the grocery store, I'll have to use my debit card, for example, or if I got to pay the water bill or I see the DMV bill right here, I got to pay those ones. So I do keep some money in a checking or savings. But normally, let's say I have a $200,000 lying around. That'd be amazing if I did. Let's say I did though. Should I put it in a savings account? The answer is that no. You should definitely not put that in a savings account. Okay. You should not put that in a checking account. You should go do something with that money. You should invest it, right? We should buy stocks, mutual funds, or property, something with that money that will give us a higher return. Okay. So keeping that $200,000 in mind, this is my extra, my play money right here. If the bank is offering, let's make it realistic here, 0.01%, which is pretty much what a checking account is, might even be a savings account, I have to check. Most people aren't going to take that value up on it, okay? It's just not worth it. And this is quantity of money right here. So $10 might be total of what the bank gets. Actually, let's make it a little more realistic. Let's say it's 100. Okay. What that is I might have $50 in there to pay for bills. Some person B might have another $10 in there, and then person C might have it. But it's just to pay for bills. I'm not put this 200 in here. Now, what if it increased it a little bit more? Let's say they went and splurged to 1%. Okay. Well, they might get some more money in there, right? That's not too bad. Okay, so I might put some more of this in here just to keep it because it's 1%, not losing that much. But again, it's not that great if inflation is 3%. But what if they did something like this where they said the interest rate was 4%? Okay. At 4%, I might put in here my half of that. Okay? I might say, oh, that's a pretty good deal. Let's put 100,000 in there. Okay. And this is actually how it works too. I try to explain this to other teachers, but they don't always understand. So for example, again, you guys are learning my finances a little too well here, but most schools get paid 10 months. So I don't get paid 10 months, the months I work. I don't work June and July. I don't get paid June, July. Okay. So what happens is schools first, which is that little credit union you guys have right there. And again, we talked about them before. You got to be part of the education to be part of that one. What happens is they offer something called a summer savers or a paycheck saver. They offer about 4%, which is really good. I try to maximize that one out, and I try to tell other teachers to do that too. The reason it's such a good deal is I get that 4% lock, which is better than inflation, right? The bank likes it because they know for those 10 months they can do whatever they want with the money because I can't touch it. But they'll know consistent period that I'll come get half of it in June and I'll get the other half of it in July because it's supposed to make up 2 months you're not paid, is how it works. So it works out pretty good. Now I would like to do this one. The reason is I'm risk averse. I know right now the stock market is paying 11%, but that could fall and take a big hit. It's not guaranteed. It's just on average right now for the past year, it's been about 11%. So if you're not very risky, I know, for example, I'm going to get back that money in 10 months later and I can do with whatever I want. The stock, I have to sell it and then I have to move it over and I'm going to hit with capital gains and all that other stuff. So it's a good deal. As the interest rates get better and better, what if they offered me 11%? If they offered me 11%, they'd have the whole thing. I wouldn't even waste my time on the stock market at that point. Okay. The bank was giving me 11%. I wouldn't even waste my time in the stock market. It's just too great of a deal to actually do it. So notice here why supply changes, because I can control the supply on this one, as with you as well too. When we figure interest rates are good, we'll invest in it. Now, one thing I need you to take a look at here, at 11%, yeah, I might want to put my money in the bank for sure, but I'm definitely not borrowing the money. 11%, forget it. Loan shark at that point. So what happens is everything drives down to the point where we get equilibrium. Okay, so that's how it's going to work as it goes through. So let's charge ahead here. So here's the graph. Let's put this in our notes here because we're going to look at how this works. And we're going to actually address one of the problems that we haven't dealt with before, and that is the idea of crowding out. Okay, so we're going to look at crowding out here. Now, I talked about this briefly in the previous unit, and I said, we're just going to ignore it and pretend it's not an issue for now because we're just worrying about shifting on fiscal policy. But now it's an issue, and we got to take a look at it. Okay, so what do we want to do? At the equilibrium rates, moms want to borrow and lend. Yeah, yada, yada, yada. What's the situation? Okay, so this is how we label it. That's the equilibrium, right? We'll call this our real interest rate, and that's our loans. Okay. And the government wants to do deficit spending. Okay. So it's going to borrow from the private sector. This is where our crowding out is going to come into effect here. Okay. Now let's talk about why the government would want to do this first. Okay. Because this is actually a really good idea the government's having. So I'm going to draw this over here. You're going to see how this is all starting to connect back to our LRAS graph. So here's my aggregate demand. Here's my aggregate supply. Ideally, when would the government want to increase its spending? When we're in a recession, right? So if we're in a recession like we are here, ideally the government should increase its spending and not change taxes, right? You don't want to change taxes. Or you can even decrease taxes, but you don't want to increase taxes. So let's say the government calculates how short they are and they say, okay, we need to increase aggregate demand by this much. This means this is how much we need to increase our spending for. Calculating the multiplier and everything, they would say this much. Well, they need to go to the banks to borrow the money because that's where they're going to get it from. Can't get it from the Fed, going to get it from the banks. Okay. So they go to the banks and say, hey, we need some money here. We need X amount of dollars to solve this recession. So they borrow the money just like we would, and then they go and spend this to get our aggregate demand right up here. Okay. But thinking back at what is crowding out, remember I talked about this. I said they build a nice library in Walnut. What's going to happen to your private spending? You guys no longer need to spend privately anymore because you got every book you're ever going to need in that library. So you're not going to spend it anymore. Here's the actual effect that is happening in this one. Notice interest rate has gone up. Okay, government spending increased, interest rate has gone up because the government is now demanding more money. And we already know, because we covered this one here, when your interest rates go up, your aggregate demand goes down. Okay, so what really happens in this graph here is that when they do this, draw this just perfect. It decreases aggregate demand ever so slightly. Okay. The reason is that slight investment goes down, slight consumer spending goes down. Because let's say the interest rate was here 3% and it goes up to 8%. That's a huge change, especially if you're getting a mortgage. 3%, do it. 8%, it's not a deal anymore. It's really not worth it taking it 8%. That's actually really, really high at that point. Okay. So I wouldn't borrow the money anymore. I would look at it like, why do I want to borrow the money and buy a house? It's too high of an interest rate. So I might say no. Okay. But notice that's what happens. The government borrowed the money to try and fix our recession. But the same thing, by doing that, they've actually increased the interest rates, which makes us consumers and businesses want to spend less. And that's the crowding out issue that we're going to have to fix. Okay. Now let's look at the shifters here. Okay. We'll talk about how to fix this later. What needs to happen is the Fed needs to change the supply of money to kind of fix this. So that's why they work together. Even South Park knows if you crowd out the loadable funds market, you're going to have a bad time. Okay, so let's look at the shifters here. Let's look at the demands one. Put all your money in a savings account. First one, perceived business opportunities. If the economy is looking stable, things are looking good, business will go, hey, this is a good time to expand. Okay, so they'll borrow money in that particular case. That happens from time to time. The big one that we'll see mostly is going to be government borrowing, whether it's a deficit, budget deficit, or budget surplus. The government, when they borrow money, it's going to affect us. Okay, this is what's going to cause the crowding out here as it goes through. Supply shifters, there are 3 of those ones. Changes in savings behavior. Let me give you an example of this one. Back in the 90s, when we had the .com, okay, going back to our marginal propensity to save. It's a propensity. Remember, the government has no control over it. Our propensity to save at this point was really small. I think it was like 5% for every dollar that we have. Pretty much we didn't save it. People were spending money like crazy. Whether it was buying stocks or just buying material things, people spent it. Okay. Then in the 2000s, what happened is we had the .com bust. Boom. People got scared. They lost a lot of money. And our marginal propensity to save changed. It went to 10%. Now, the government's not controlling this. This just happened naturally. People freaked out. 9/11 happened as well, too. So people started saving more money. Then we had 2008. We had the Great Recession. And this was a big hit. For a long time, our marginal propensity to save jumped up for the people who could afford it to 20%. And that became average. And again, those were just natural changes in behavior. Okay. Really, you don't see this one on a test too much. They would be really specific. People change their saving behavior. Okay. Because you can't control it, right? It's just what our proclivity is for wanting to do these things. Okay. Changes in foreign investment. This is an interesting one. Okay. We'll actually deal with this one more when we get back from winter break, but I'll talk about it here and I'll use again my anecdotal idea. Okay. So you guys learn from my finances. So back in 2000, just to kind of give you a reference here. So this is 2000, we'll call this the United States, USA. Okay, USA CD. So our CD rates in the 2000, this I really didn't know too much was going on, but my wife was much more on this one. She talks about how you used to be able to get CDs for 1 year, and we're just going to do 1 year, between 5 to 7%. That is amazing. She used to talk about how she put pretty much all her money on CDs because her dad wanted something very safe, and that was good. By 2010, the rates for CDs had fallen to where it was now 2 to 3%. Okay. And in 2020, because now the interest rate is so low, if you want a reference, it is less than 1.5%. Okay. So they've gone down. Okay. Really, what I want to look at is this one right here. this 2 to 3% because I want to go back here. Okay, so how does this foreign investment work? Well, at the time we had some money and we not a whole lot, okay, but we had some extra money and we wanted to do something with it. And CDs just weren't cutting it at the time. Pretty much a flush with inflation. It wasn't a great deal. It wasn't a bad deal, but it wasn't anything spectacular to write home about. It wasn't making money. However, our one of our, I forget what they call it, financial advisors suggested, because we were at a Chinese bank at the time, that China had an interest rate of 10%. Okay. Inflation rate is higher there. Remember, we keep ours at 3. Inflation rate for them was at 5%. Okay. But you can see how this is working. Interest rate is 10%, inflation rate's 5%. That means our return total value is a 5% gain. Okay. And at this time, we weren't really diverse in the stock market uh, like 11 years ago. But I can tell you this, 5% is much higher than 2 to 3%. So what we did is we took all our US dollars and we converted them to the renminbi, or BM. I wonder why they have two. Okay. Yuan. That's the symbol that they use. So we converted them into there and we dumped it into an account. So we created an account over in China and we put it in a savings account and just collected the interest rate right here for a long time. And we were getting a 5% return once we brought it back. Now that only lasted for a few years because then China dropped down its interest rate that they were giving to about 6%, and their inflation rate is still 5%. Well, then at that point, it's no longer worth it anymore. It was better to bring it back and do something else with it. But for a long time there, China was giving a good interest rate back and you could collect it right there. And people do that all the time, especially people a little bit more savvier will convert it into different currencies, collect the interest rates, and then bring it back. Now, you have to be careful because you get subject to those countries' laws and maybe their taxes on how everything works. So you got to know a little bit of what you're doing. Our financial advisor, that's what they focused on. So she was really good at doing that one. I particularly don't know. Okay. I still can't tell you because I don't know China's laws or how it works. So you would need to someone who is more adverse. And there might be better ones. Maybe Zimbabwe, for example, has a really good interest rate. Again, you would need someone who is versed in dealing with Zimbabwe's banks to do that for you. But there are people who do that. Okay. There are people who will put money inside the United States. My wife's aunt, for example, lives in Taiwan, but will put it here in the United States to collect interest rates if they feels it's a better deal. Okay. And then we'll deal with this one here. This is your profitability as far as dealing with how much money you have in the bank. And this is going to be one particular situation, and I'll show you that right now. Okay, so